There's no cure for white supremacy. There's just no platforming it. By also referring to Charles Darwin's evolution of the species, those who did not evolve with the species ended up dying out. And this is what will happen to the Kari Kriels, to the Steve Hofmeyrs, to the Ronaldo Gous, to the Rob Hersofs, to everyone who espouse certain controversial, sort of a countercultural, right-wing, rebellious narrative because they think it's edgy, because they think it's clickbaity. It might be in the next 5 years, but it's not sustainable.
Welcome to the program. Before I introduce my guest, as you know, I'm a South African, I'm an Afrikaner who represented the SABC in Europe during those fragile years in the early 90s of our transition. And when Black economic empowerment, known as transformation those days, happened to me, I lost my job here in Europe as a representative for the SABC. And I got stuck over here, did what I could do to survive, and now, retired, I am pouring that which is left in me in whatever I can do to sort of take an outsider's view on what's happening inside South Africa to try to untangle the wreckage that South Africa has in the meantime become, hopefully, pushing the conversation forward in South Africa. Now, it's a different introduction from my usual introductions, and why I'm explaining this to you is because during the last couple of weeks I'd been criticized by a number of people that are supporters of the Not in My Name Declaration, group of Afrikaners that made the Not in My Name Declaration. And they've hammered me, accusing me of playing footsie, playing easy with the Afrikaner right, with the Jaco Kleinhanses, the Ernst Rutzes, the Willem Petzers of our world. Petzer, that podcaster, by the way, who has reached millions and millions of people, millions and millions of hits, rather, with his work, and even got himself a mention in the New York Times. The people that criticize me also tell me that I tend to talk to people on the fringes, on the edges. And I have to admit that they are quite right. Yes, I do talk to people like Karel Niehaus or Andile Masitama. And yes, they're right. I do so on purpose because I believe that you can only explore the center, the middle, if you're also prepared to go onto the outer edges, which is exactly what I'm trying to do with this podcast. So today, my guest is, and that's how I usually start my program, by saying my guest is really the other end of the Kleinhanses, the other end of the Ernst Rutzes, or once again, the podcaster Willem Petzer, who, incidentally, I have invited to join this very podcast next week following this podcast, and to help me deconstruct this discussion in the hope to further the discussion in South Africa. So to go to the way I usually introduce my program, I am delighted to say that my guest is Doctor Tristán Kapp. I think he calls himself the friendly Satanist. Tristán, what a pleasure.
Thank you, Johan. And it's formally the friendly Satanist, although, as you said, it's somewhat something I did identify with formally.
You are still, though, an atheist, a non-believer. My question would be, are you saying, and are you actively campaigning or working in that direction, that religion is an ill for society?
My main grief merely is with organized religion that exploits people, the enduring legacies of whiteness, the enduring legacies of appropriation, and sort of the demonization of the other. I just finished the wonderful book by Erika Borman on the KwaZulu-Bantu faith mission, and thereafter John Oosthuizen prolific journalist of religion in South Africa and ex-correspondent for the Kerkbode in the Dutch Reformed Church, who wrote the book Die Opkomst en Ondergang van die NG Kerk, or The Rise and Fall of the Dutch Reformed Church, and how we see the Dutch Reformed Church and the church in South Africa as a whole as a form of, a way of how individuals refuse to get with the times, as we recently saw with the Reformed Church, who recently decided that women are no longer allowed to be preachers. So that very archaic system is sort of represented, especially if we're talking about the Afrikaans churches. Mainly, these churches have been the cultural zeitgeist tone givers to a certain degree, which has resulted in a stunting of critical thinking amongst Afrikaans people. And so, in a nutshell, I do believe that organized religion is the social ill, and that that I spoke to Lester Kivett on, I think it was 702 OK Talk Radio a while ago, about this whole idea that religion in South Africa needs to be regulated. Because of the fact that we've got so many other professions like psychology, anthropology, architecture, psychiatry, and the medical field that is, and even teachers who are regulated by a regulatory body. But in South Africa, we do not have that. And I think that is essentially what my scholarship aims to navigate towards, sort of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, as I think it was a journalist who said that earlier in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken.
How did ditching religion and embracing non-religion, the real world, or whatever, the verifiable world around you, what is the value it gave you? How did it change your view of the world, your perception of and understanding of life, your world?
I think to a degree, it freed me from a lot of oppressive systems. I think I remember during my master's, I encountered this brilliant book by a Dutch researcher in theology, Wessel Stoker, who wrote the book called Is Faith Rational? A phenomenological, epistemological consideration of faith, where he essentially interrogates where we get the idea of why we believe what we believe. And additionally, with philosophies of Nietzsche, I realized that interrogating the preconceptions and the way you've been programmed to think, which sounds very conspiratorial in its phrasing, but I essentially refer to the fact of how you grow up with a cultural reference. And this is what Stoker references as a preconfiguration. And this preconfiguration is something you do not realize. And this is something that is, for example, present in a lot of non-religious conversations and critical scholarship on religion, where it, for example, says that if you were born in Pakistan, you might as well be a Muslim. Or if you are born in a certain part of India, you'd be a Hindu. Or if you're born in Tibet, you'd be a Buddhist. So essentially, religion manifests itself in a pre-configuration sense as a contrived system of control that depends on your geographical location. And so realizing this as I moved my way out of religion was simultaneously freeing myself from these oppressive doctrines that restricted myself and restricted my experience of the world. And I learned to grasp life to the fullest, realizing that there's no hereafter, realizing that there's no sort of eternal life, freed me from the consequences of forcing myself to be someone whom I'm not. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with when they are stuck in religion, but they don't realize. And so I've also been, as a form of, vocal deconstructionist, I've simultaneously showcased the form of grief that one goes through your entire life when you leave religion. Essentially, you go from the sort of depression phase, you go through the anger phase, which was the friendly Satanist phase, honestly. And essentially, at some stage, you arrive at a place where you engage in a liminal space, where, for example, I think Nietzsche has the perfect analogy of that reconfiguration, as Stoker puts it, in terms of figuring for yourself what I believe, is it rational or not? And so engaging with life in a sort of childlike and playfulness fashion. And so Nietzsche has this phenomenal idea of even though he engenders this or symbolizes this lion that rebels against the thou shalt and thou shalt nots of society, the lion eventually grows to be a child and sort of engages playfully with the world, no longer satisfied with merely rebellion, but simultaneously also using rebellion in a constructive way, but simultaneously giving credit where credit is due. And that, I believe, is something that one ought to arrive at when one comes at religion. And I think I often have times where I recognize within myself these sort of grief phases that I go through. I think it's been almost 10 years now that I've been non-religious, and deconstructing actively the confines of religion and sort of discovering things in myself. So I think it's a wonderful journey, and I think a lot of people, it takes a lot of bravery to leave religion. It takes a lot of guts, because of the fact that you will not be the most popular individual in the party. Trust me, I know.
Yeah. That's something I wanted to touch on, because let's skip all the theory now, but just the lived experience of that within the context of a deeply religious society. How easy or how difficult is that to actually, because you know as well as I do that when you move but a millimeter outside the parameters that the folk sets for you, you become very easily a target and an outsider and an outcast. So how did you and how do you handle that, and how did you experience that? How much room was given to you from your environment to emancipate yourself in the way in which you believe you had?
Well, I think a large degree, my parents were very open-minded, and I have
a great help.
That was a very great help. And so they've never forced religion on me, even though their raising of me was Dutch Reformed, in the NG Kerk, the typical hub of what Jean Oosthuizen refers to as the Nasionale Partij in Gebed, or the National Party in Prayer. I think that was the cultural reference that I got. And I think the idea, and I think this is what drove me to literature, especially written by figures like Jean Oosthuizen and Ben de Tooy, and these books sort of garnered a fascination with me due to the fact that they similarly showcase that even moving a millimeter from the folk and the standard that you ostensibly need to adhere to, even though you can have the greatest familial support you want, but overall that does not guarantee it outwardly. So I've gotten a lot of rejection from inside the house, essentially. Not my family necessarily, not my sort of
house,
close family.
You mean the house, you mean your Afrikaans environment, or
yes,
white environment,
exactly.
or folk?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, correct. So I've gotten a lot of criticism from that, and sort of, I'm still the black sheep of the family per se. But then you've also got the other aspect of where the more vocal I became, the more sort of aggression I sort of elicited, which was quite, in the beginning, a shock to me, because I found quite ironically, to my own chagrin, that sort of identifying loudly as an atheist will elicit quite a lot of death threats from the overly pious. And even more so when you identify as alternative and when you go through a certain phase. So there's a lot of restrictiveness and a very much a lacking reception to sort of the other. And this is something that Jean Oosthuizen in his book and these thinkers themselves also highlight. In the sense that there is very little space to move outside the margins. But I mean, death threats aside, the hatred that I get on a daily basis aside from individuals, aside of a certain peculiarity who sort of have Bible verses in their Facebook bios or social media bios, essentially someone has to do it. Someone needs to walk so others can run. And I think that I wouldn't sort of, I believe, I wouldn't sort of accolade myself with the authority necessarily, or that sort of arrogance to say that I'm paving the way for someone. I'm merely trying my best to sort of make sense of things on my own way and using academia as a way to make sense through these complex conversations, but simultaneously forcing change where change is necessary. Because what is credibility if I cannot use it to the advantage of those who do not have the privileges that I have to my advantage? And so I think that, in essence, I believe this is the advantage that I believe non-religion and the deconstruction has provided me, while simultaneously not fitting in any sense, has provided me with. So in a sense, it has been, if I am to use a more religious term, blessing in disguise.
I'd like to just touch on, for lack of a better word, just the emotion of it all that you experience yourself, leaving home in a certain way, leaving the nest in a certain way, the safety of the familiar environment in a certain way. How did that, or how does that impact on you? Because you also, I suspect in the process, must have a sense of loss of something as well in the process.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there was deeply psychological, because what catalyzed it essentially was that I walked home from a psychology semester test during my undergraduate studies, because my parents didn't buy me a car when I got out of matric. And eventually I got stabbed with a knife when, during a mugging, someone tried to steal my phone. So I have a deep, intimate acknowledgement of violence. And after going through therapy, I realized that all of these sort of wounds that emerged with the mugging were essentially of a religious nature, and that I were essentially grieving an identity because of the fact that this is what people do not realize about religion. And this is why even something such as PTSD or RSD, which is religious trauma, or RTS, religious trauma syndrome, is such an understudied field in psychology, because of the fact that people do not yet quite comprehend what leaving religion does to the psyche. And I think in many instances, as a Christian, I got lucky leaving Christianity, because of the fact that in other religions, there are instances where you get, stoned, or in the case of Erika Borman's situation of the KwaZulu-Bantu, where she was left to her own devices. Yeah. So I think it's through these lenses that one realizes it's not that simple.
Did you ever, or do you identify as an Afrikaner?
No, I do not.
Yeah. What do you think as an Afrikaner?
I think as an Afrikaans speaking person, I think as a South African, which I think is far more important in terms of our country's complex history than associating myself with such a niche construct that is debated by historians across cultural, ethnic lines. So I do think in Afrikaans, and therefore I do not ascribe myself to be an Afrikaner necessarily in a cultural sense, but rather that I do consider myself as a South African committed to the collective goal of its people, regardless of which race, creed, or religion they come from.
I've lived for many, many years here in Holland. I have never once, at whatever level, encountered Dutch people that were busy navel staring and talking about their identity as Dutch people. Why do we have that obsession in South Africa? Is that something born out of some sense of fear?
I think it's not born out of fear. I think it's a multi-layered conversation, which starts with religion, with Christianity, with the fact that from the outset, the idea of Reformed Christian Calvinism was that the individual who ascribes to Calvinism is part of a elect few. That's where we get the doctrine of election from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, which was formative to the Afrikaner religion. Remember, as you, for example, know, that the Dutch brought with them the Kuiperian theology of Abraham Kuyper, and the French Huguenots brought with them the French Calvinism, which both morphed in the sense of the Dutch producing the spherical independence of that basically the preliminary ideas of apartheid formed in the spherical independence of that. A lot of communities can be separate but still work towards the common good, and where the French Protestant idea of election, where Calvin chose these few people, and where essentially, according to this doctrine, people choose themselves out of this mere good pleasure, or God chooses these people out of his mere good pleasure. And so fast forward to all of the political history, which I must admit is too historically complex to fit into a single explanation. But arriving at the Afrikaner nationalism, which sort of was born out of the oppression that the Afrikaners experienced at the hand of the English by not really belonging in the English, in the Eurocentric chosen sense, and not also in the Dutch Eurocentric sense. And so as such, I believe that there has been a cultural tradition of these individuals searching for identity, searching for legitimacy, in the sense of that they are indeed the chosen people. This is what we see with the nationalist movements of the AfriForum and this idea of their adherence to Israel vision. And essentially afterwards that we see with Afrikaners pandering to Donald Trump. It's that sense of legitimacy, that sense of messianic liberation that they perceive from European strongmen that essentially sort of symbolize everything that they aspire to be but cannot, due to the fact that they are extant or living amongst an idea of black majority rule and black majority democracy in Southern Africa, where as a white person you are equal, not special, and not subservient to, but equal. And I think it underscores, it is said and remarked quite poignantly by Professor Tudi Madonsela, who not long ago mentioned that they are struggling with being equal. And so in this identity crisis, and mentioning with the moral panics, these are all ways of searching for identity. And when you do not have your identity in and of yourself, everybody else around you is your enemy. That does not look like you, that does not walk like you, that does not talk like you. And so I think that this is why Afrikaners and Afrikaans people in South Africa are obsessed with identity. But on the positive aspect, I also believe that it's an important function to know your identity, but as a collective, not as a nationalist project that happened, for example, in 1930, or no, after 1938 at the centenary celebration of the Great Track, where the Afrikaners perceived themselves as God's chosen nation in being saved from the evil Zulus during the fight at Blood River.
Yeah. You use specifically now the term God's chosen people. Is it manifest amongst, I talk in very broad terms now, the idea amongst Afrikaners that we God's chosen people, and how does it manifest itself and what does it mean?
So the idea is absolutely manifest in Afrikaans culture, and you can see it throughout Afrikaans cultural history.
In modern day contemporary South Africa, as I'm sitting here and you're sitting there?
Not necessarily in the contemporary sense, but throughout history and perhaps on a subconscious level, maybe. But throughout the history of individuals like D.F. Malan and even John Foster, who noted that Christian nationalism is on par with National Socialism in the 1940s. And even Ben Schoeman, who was a minister of parliament, who noted that the Afrikaners' Christian nationalism and Afrikaners' identity is completely and absolutely dependent on the victory of the Nazi regime in World War II. So there's definitely, especially also in contemporary South Africa, this idea of chosenness. One of the particular projects that I am focusing on is Israel Vision, which is a particular faction, which is a millenarian sect that broke away from the Dutch Reformed tradition either during the late apartheid stages or early during democracy, where essentially Afrikaners perceive themselves as God's chosen nation, in the sense of where they are part of the lost tribes of Israel, where you would, for example, see it being based on the works of F.W.C. Neusser, who wrote the book in the 50s about this idea of Afrikaners being the lost tribes of Israel. Not too long ago, there was this guy called Joe Lawrence on TikTok who, for example, presented himself as this prophet and frequently based his theology on the Apartheid book, or the Apartheid van Yahweh, which is also known as the Book van Herinnering, or the Book of Reminiscing. And a year ago, I believe there was also a series on Showmax called The Illuminated, where they featured Israel Visi and this guy who calls himself the Bushian van Migdol, who de facto affiliates himself with this ideology of Afrikaners and the Boer folk being associated with God's chosen nation, and sort of creating this age-old romanticized narrative that emerged after the Anglo-Boer War, even with the ideas of D.F. Malan and Paul Kruger even, and sort of created this idea based on also the cultural and theological remarks of Sinner van Rensburg as this godly, mythological, chosen collective that essentially are chosen to rule and chosen to sort of have a independent, self-determination, nationalist state.
Does that still live in the fabric of the Afrikaner today? How does it express itself, and what does it mean? What does it mean for reconciliation? What does it mean for nation building? What does it mean if you are exclusive from the other? If you other the other, if that's your condition, what does that mean for us moving forward to build the so-called, well, the Rainbow Nation idea, I think, has collapsed, symbolically at least, but what does it mean for nation building?
So firstly, I think, yes, it does manifest in South Africa. And I've recently done a study on this last year about understanding how this narrative manifests in the sort of refugee situation with Afrikaners. And how, for example, I encountered a book written by a certain guy called Helgaard Muller, not the rugby player, but a guy who shares his name, who published a book in the early 2020s, on which is titled Donald J. Trump, the Son of Man, the Christ, in which this narrative of Donald Trump essentially emerges as a messianic figure.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, in the Afrikaner narrative, this has absolutely, even not perhaps objectively, but subconsciously manifested itself in the idea of Trump featuring as the epitome of white Christian nationalism. That very phenomenon that Afrikaners grew up with, that very phenomenon that was entrenched in their mindsets by individuals such as D.F. Malan, H.I. Verwoerd, as well as Professor E.P. Groenewald, who wrote a seminar, or did a seminar in the late 40s at the University of Pretoria, where he said that the Afrikaners are chosen or tasked with a divine mandate to essentially manifest and to create this idea of separation between cultures and languages.
Civilize the people of Africa.
Correct. And so this idea manifests in South Africa today, where Trump seems, again, as this sort of Christian nationalist savior. He sort of represents everything, as I said earlier, that Afrikaners aspire to be and that they culturally demand, in this idea of how they cannot reconcile equality, in the sense of how equality feels in most cases, in the majority vocal cases perhaps, of these faction of MAGA South Africans like Willem Petzer, like the US guy from Oranje, as well as Ernst Roots, these individuals who promulgate this narrative of constantly pandering to the United States and focusing on this oppressionist narratives that Afrikaners are somehow oppressed in South Africa. And so this entire religious narrative is still deeply, albeit perhaps not vocally anymore, entrenched in South Africa. Perhaps in certain fringe circles, they are still, I believe, vocally spoken towards one another. But I don't think necessarily that it's overtly there, although I tend to be skeptical about that, as I identified with my findings in my research paper called The Afrikaner Exodus, and understanding how whiteness and this idea of Afrikaner Christian chosenness manifests itself on South African social media.
Yeah, you use the word overtly now. Let me be brutal.
Mm.
Do you think that if you were now around a barbecue fire or whatever the case might be, with Willem Petzer, with Kali Kriel, with Ernst Roots, and you ask them, Willem, do you believe that you, as a member of the Afrikaans people or Afrikaanse folk, that you are chosen by God to be here, ordained by God? Do you think they would privately acknowledge that?
I think so, yes.
Avoid the direct, open. Do you think it would be fair if I? Well, let me ask you that. Should I have the pleasure of having Kali Kriel on my podcast? I've had Kali Kriel many years ago in an interview, but not on this podcast. But in my next discussion with, let's say, Ernst Roots, who I would like to invite back on the podcast, do you think I should ask him that?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely your prerogative to have them back, and
I think you know what I'm trying to say.
It's a research-informed opinion that I've established across patterns, that I've established across ideological discourse analysis, through understanding how these networks tie into each other. And I may perhaps be skeptical in the sense of how they perhaps, if they might answer in the affirmative if confronted on a podcast. But I do think that there is this mentality still engendered in them. Otherwise, why? What is the raison d'etre behind claiming to be oppressed in a society where you could be focusing about, I don't know, intercultural integration? What is the meaning behind constantly pandering to external states to redeem you or to help you in a society where you've got all the privileges? Where I've not seen the state knocking on the doors of these individuals claiming to be oppressed or oppressing them, arresting them for criticizing the ANC. I mean, just as we spoke about the gelofte earlier, this idea of the gelofte being celebrated every year in lieu of Reconciliation Day is, to me, quite self-explanatory enough that there still exists this mentality of chosenness. And this is why I'm so very critical about this idea still not existing in society, because of the fact that if we were against this narrative, if there was a collective denial of this narrative still not being entrenched in our lingua franca or in the way we think about ourselves and society, what necessitates the celebration of the gelofte, which is by existence celebratory of this idea that God loved white people more than he did black people, and therefore he killed black people or allowed the white people who were imperial foreigners and sort of invaders to the land who weren't supposed to be there in the beginning and wanted to negotiate the land from under the feet of Dingaan, as most historians today acknowledge. This idea essentially comes down to the fact of why do they need to celebrate this painfully polemical aspect of history? Why is it necessary when you identify as a collective in a democratic South Africa, if you do not believe yourself to be God's chosen nation? Then it makes such celebrations of the gelofte obsolete. Then it makes the celebration and the pandering to Trump as Christian nationalist hero and sort of messianic figure obsolete.
Now, I imagine if I ask you the question now, and I think I know what your answer would be about, let's talk about Blood River and about the Covenant. It seems to me quite rational to, in a very rational way, explain that the Voortrekkers had the advantage of technology on their side.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me rational that most intelligent, rational people today should actually see that, understand that, recognize that, acknowledge that. But in the cells of the body, it's not experienced as such. Am I correct in saying that?
Absolutely. And this is something that is noted by a lot of anthropologists and historians about history within the Afrikanerdom being constructed as a nationalist project, where, for example, you would even see Elizabeth van Heiningen, who wrote an entire book about the Boer Wars and the concentration camps, where essentially that concentration camp history is very much mythologized and co-opted by the Afrikaner as a nationalist project. Although historians such as Professor Frans Johannes Pretorius criticizes such reductionist and sort of revisionist assumptions, because it eliminates the nuance of these complexities and the suffering that individuals such as the Afrikaners experienced under the British. But it still reminds us the fact that these historical ideas, similar to what Hermann Göring did with, for example, the English during the Nuremberg trials, he took their history they had for their own nationalistic projects and endeavors and used it against them to sort of portray that they themselves have been ostensibly and overtly creating this revisionist and romanticized narrative. And there's also a wonderful article that I believe was written by Professor Hannelie Marx-Knudse on the romanticization of this Boer narrative, of how this, we can see this parallel between this romanticized idea of the Boer, of a farmer outside of this agricultural occupational space, but as an identity construct which has sort of evolved as a mythological entity that sort of creates another form of divine missionality and sort of creating again this mythology of individuals creating themselves as this divine entity that sort of exists above others, sort of re-establishing a racial hierarchy that is now obsolete. And through, as you said, that this idea of Geloftedag being rationally interpreted as, bringing an assegai to a gun and cannon fight and a gunpowder fight is somewhat obsolete, even with the military tactics of the Zulus, which is renowned throughout all of history for its innovation and innovativeness. And the strategy is somewhat completely and absolutely eradicated and supplanted with a rosy-glassed mythology of Afrikanerdom as this chosen nation.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, a lot of viewers. The viewers who've been able to stomach this discussion to this point would really, at this point, be very angry with me for even asking these questions. But I do insist on at least some objective honesty as well in our understanding of who we are. Let's change gears slightly here. You're a born free, I understand.
Yeah.
Outside your school curriculum that might have told you something about the history of South Africa, how did you unpack the package yourself, apartheid? And what was your conclusion? Because there's quite a lot of revisionism as well now amongst our beloved people, if I may say so. So how did you do it? And what was your conclusion?
Yeah, so I think that in my own house, we had very little conversations about apartheid when I was younger. But as I got older and learned more, I engaged in several debates with my mother, especially who was a single mother. Basically engaged a lot of debates with her about apartheid, and especially with my grandmother, who was a very intellectual woman who had a lot of experience. And I always joke and say that she had a lot of Dutch reformed boyfriends in her younger days. So she understood a part of South Africa's history more intimately. And so I believe that through engagement, through conversations with others in my house that I brought home, I was able to clarify and deconstruct these issues for myself. But also simultaneously, I am quite unanimous with a lot of individuals who are still actively talking about it, in saying that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, was not sufficient. It gave individuals a slap on the wrist without any meaningful consequences. And essentially that forced individuals to say, okay, we did nothing wrong, so we don't have to talk about it anymore. So we don't have to confront the uncomfortable truths of that we contributed to the ongoing injustices in society that are still perpetuating in South Africa, which includes corruption, because where else could the ANC have learned corruption if not from the colonizers who first invented corruption, from the apartheid government who also was corrupt? But all of these caricatures, as if, these historical lenses emerge in a vacuum, is something that I frustratingly had to realize. And this is something that people do not want to confront because it creates a cognitive dissonance where you have to admit that you are wrong. If I am wrong, and I'm speaking on myself, I'm happy to admit I'm wrong. If I'm provided with rational and contrary evidence, I am happy to admit that I was wrong. There's no shame in that. But in the sense of how individuals would rather, and I'm going to refer back to the whole conundrum with Afrikaners and the Donald Trump situation, where they would much rather appeal to external parties like the American state to liberate them from sort of their struggle against reality, as Monty Python would put it. I believe that is the epitome of arrogance to me.
Yeah.
And I think that it's these individuals that are not willing to confront the past because they believe they did nothing wrong. Whereas the individuals on the sideline, which I have had ample conversations with, and you need only scroll on TikTok, for example, where I've had the most intelligent and inclusive conversations coming from the very EFF members, for example, which has been ostensibly caricaturized and created as demagogues by these very far-right individuals who have engaged in very fruitful conversations. And I'm using EFF not as a sort of a political alignment, but also sort of an ideological extreme, which is commonly used as this caricature that people commonly scapegoat. There's no politics involved. There's critiques of every single politician. And there's a simultaneous understanding of that history does not exist in a vacuum, but there is this consciousness that if we do not address the past, if we do not recognize that history has a tendency to rhyme, as Mark Twain put it, then we are doing ourselves a disservice.
I spoke to an Afrikaner academic last night, the night before last night, somebody you happen to know. I'll tell you later, post this discussion, who it is, who told me about the work of the Polish scientist and writer Robert Sapolsky, who wrote a book called Behave, I think it is, and I've noted here Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Very charming title for an academic piece of work, in which what I deduct out of the discussion is more or less that the scientist Sapolsky says that our predisposition to negative experiences in life, racism, discrimination, is something that is almost on, she called it a cellular level, biological level, embedded in us. And then if you take the conversation a step further and you say, well, if that's the case, if it is, as she says, biologically, in a cellular way, embedded within us, almost genetic within us, you become scared, because how do you get people to reconcile unless you are very consciously busy with dissection, unless you're very consciously aware of the fact that this is embedded in your soul. My question at the end of the day is, no, we've not gone through that process clearly. At the end of the day, the question remains, should we not go back to that again, to try to actually undo the ills of apartheid, or at least to set the steps to move forward in the future?
Race is a social construct.
Yeah.
Racism is a social construct. If we are to expand that and say that, and I know this evil of the critical race theory is going to make the conservatives' heads reel, but it is what it is. If racism or race is a social construct that has been created similar to gender, similar to ideology and religion, then we need to acknowledge that racism is also a social construct, and that it's stupid to have a social construct that is not beneficial to society. And that I think that in the era of information, there is no excuse to be a racist. There is no excuse to still have racist opinions. And simultaneously, another way that I also believe that racism manifests itself is, for example, in the perception of crime, where, as I said earlier, there is a presiding narrative among certain white people where black people are still perceived as foaming around the mouth, who do not possess the same cognitive faculties and intellectability that a lot of forward-thinking white South Africans have. And this is what I've experienced at the head of black people. They are the most intelligent, erudite, and forward-thinking individuals. But when we see the videos propagandistically spearheaded by individuals who are propagating a certain agenda, they want to reinforce this narrative that black people are incapable of rational thought, of humanity, that they are demagogues foaming around the mouth that are ready to murder you because of the fact that you have a white skin. I have never experienced as much racism from Black people as I have from Afrikaners, who have, for example, directed homophobic slurs, gender slurs, you name it, against me, purely because of the fact that I'm not even Black, purely because I look different and challenge the conventional standards. And that brings me to my point. To answer your question, we need to combat these individuals by not theorizing, as academics are prone to do, but increase empathy. And to increase empathy, we need to expose others to the struggle, to what it means to fight for your existence. The only way I could understand how gay people, or what gay people felt, for example, to use a certain degree of a closer familiarity of a group that also exists alongside myself on the Fringes, is the fact that how they experience day-to-day life. By making friends with Angie Ooh, the late lesbian rapper, before she got famous, I saw the vitriol directed at her. I took part in her struggle in fighting against those who sought to dismantle and, take away her human rights to basically just love who she wants to love. And so I think that takes a sense of moving outside of your paradigm, which is something I've always been forced to do. I wasn't given anything on a silver platter, and that forced me to engage certain things critically, evaluate things critically. Arguing that racism is embodied in a molecular and cellular level is sort of a blanket statement to justify it, to say it's okay. It's like saying that being...
It should not be that. It should not necessarily be that. It should just acknowledge the fact as well, at the same time, if I may, that we have a huge problem here. If the Afrikaans people was ever part of the rainbow, I guess that would have been the orange part. If they were part of that rainbow, I think that part has left the rainbow. I hate to say it, but I think in real terms, is lost to the appeals that you are making intellectually, through study, through thinking. So my question is, how do we take that, what you say, and Dr. Lindy Koorts, who I spoke to recently, Yanni de Villiers, who I spoke recently, the people of the Not in My Name, Piet Krokams, how do we package this to come to a story that makes sense, that can build the future at the same time and bring people along? You understand my criticism?
Yeah, I completely understand your question. And I loved, your conversations with Dr. Lindy Koorts, as well as Yanni and Prof. Piet Krokams. They're all individuals whom I deeply admire for their forward-thinkingness in terms of how they perceive the crisis that we are in.
Yeah.
And I think there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and I wouldn't presume to speak for others in how the future should be navigated. But I think in general, it's about responsibility, taking responsibility and accountability. The idea of the people of AfriForum and Solidarity and these individuals have conveniently constructed a caricature that they are unable to define. Because I can't tell you how many times I've engaged in conversations where I've had these conservatives accuse me of being a white liberal, commie, leftist, whatever you want to engage in that word salad. But upon asking to define them, to define these pejoratives intellectually, they resort to insults and sort of storm out of the conversation. And which tells me everything I need to know. It's because of the fact that these individuals do not know whom they are fighting against. These individuals have only created an enemy, and I believe this is what Noam Chomsky created and said quite poignantly when he said that when you want to control a people, create them an invisible enemy and portray yourself as their savior. Simultaneously, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek uttered the same sort of sentiment in his article, and I think in the early 2000s, on the danger of populism, where he said that this idea of populism sort of eliminates the ability to think critically. It creates this enemy that forces you to sort of neglect all your critical functions. It brings me back to the idea of cults. I believe AfriForum and Solidarity, just like MAGA, is a cult, where there is a coercive system, where information is limited, and which you are segregated and you are essentially taken advantage of. That is why I call them Boer-only fans, because they operate on the same platform. They operate in the way of soliciting these funds or these caricatures for their own gain. And they spread this as this as misinformation, such as what we see with the Washington memorandum that they presented to the Donald Trump, and sort of creating this idea of Afrikaners as special victims. They have been critiqued innumerable times by scholars such as Nikki Volkov, sociologists like Christie van der Westhuizen, as well as historians like Dr. Lindy Koorts, who have all implied these scientific evidences and conversations to prove to them why they are wrong. And it's not about the dumbing it down, because I believe there are quite a few of academics like myself who are passionate about the democratization of knowledge. Individuals such as Yanni and myself have written articles to the Daily Maverick exposing this sort of narrative in a simplistic and bite-sized sense. I've also posted a copious amount of blog articles on my website to which create this narrative towards more sensibility. But there's only so much I can do if individuals are not sort of moving towards educating themselves.
Let me say this, Tristán. I have, in this short space of time that we've spoken and we just met each other today, I put a cap on my respect for your intellect, your passion, what you believe in. I really do, absolutely. But the question that is still taking all of that, and it sounds brutal if I say it that way, and maybe it's lack of time to try to find a better way to formulate it, but what squashes all of that call for, that call that you are making, is my question that I wrote down here is, the left seems to me, Lindy, Max de Prier, people that I have a great respect with, and I understand the language that they speak, but they seem, compared to the other side, frail and incompetent in nuancing a message, in shaping a narrative that can grab the imagination of the people, which is the essential thing that is needed, at least for this stream of thought in South Africa. And that, in a sense, if I would include myself in that, we've lost the game. We've lost the game. Let me just qualify this. I took note here. Willem Petzer, as an individual, I don't know what academic status he has or not has, or experience he has or not has, he has garnered in the last 2 years between 5 to 10 million views on his material. That's what deep research shows you. And I kept on going back to these things. He has AfriForum and Solidarity. They talk about getting, in terms of just their social media expression, something in the last 2 years, something like 20 to 50 million contact points, communication points. These are the guys that are running the show at the moment. And that's my concern and my fear then, is who's in control of the Afrikaner narrative? And what does that mean for the future? And then you can immediately start making 10 more questions on that. Is the Afrikaner then ultimately a stumble block in the way of the multiracial, the success of the multiracial South Africa? Are we steering to some kind of a clash? How do we do this? How do we handle that? How do we turn the boat around?
That's a very fair point that you're making. And I think I think it's a very, I believe, relevant point to raise, albeit part of the complex idea of conversation. But I think what makes Willem Petzer, and I had the privilege of being invited to lecture on this at a seminar on the Global South at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, Peru, where I explained that based on these far-right figures, whom I've studied on social media, based on themes like anti-intellectualism and tracing why they have the reach and understanding they do, is because of the fact that they prioritize the intellect of the yeoman, the, the common folk, who have essentially for, I don't know how long, because of decades, because of cults, you can blame who you want, the Dutch Reformed Church, Steve Hofmeyr, Ronaldo Goos, whoever, have sort of fostered and nursed this distrust in the very officers they had respect for. I remember during my grandmother's time,
you just repeat that last I didn't get that last.
So they have created a distrust,
yes,
nursed a distrust in the very individuals and officers they once held a high regard for.
Okay, I understand.
And I'm speaking about my grandmother's time, where she told me about in the community, you had respect for the teacher, the academic, the professor, who were pillars of the community because they held influence, even the judges back then. But due to things like anti-intellectualism, and this is what Richard Hofstadter, a historian, so brilliantly illustrates, is that we've gone from this academic as this absent-minded, woolly-minded academic to an individual who is being portrayed as the enemy of the common folk. Society has become increasingly complex, as he himself states. And things like religion, things like ideologies, things like populism, have a quick way of creating a folk narrative and getting these people on board with it, because it's easy to consume. It doesn't require mental energy. It doesn't require interrogation. It doesn't require interlocution. It requires the fact that you just have to accept it. And we all know in the age of technology, where everything is consumed, where we don't think twice fact-checking a source, we automatically assume that which stirs up an emotion in us, that must be true. And that is why these individuals have such popularity. And another example is why Charlie Kirk had such an example. And I expressed that quite directly in my article to Daily Maverick, in my opinion piece, where I said that to these individuals, you don't exist as an intellectual opponent in which there is a conversation where these individuals will sit at a table with individuals like Dr. Lindy Koorts, Max de Pre, Piet Kroukamp. They would much rather refer to them as leftists, as, kopdoek, and, whatever pejoratives they've conjured up in their mindsets that mobilizes them towards an emotion as opposed to engaging in conversation with them. Because in this conversation, and this is what one of the most fascinating philosophers and one of the most difficult philosophers I have ever had the privilege of encountering, Foucault, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, spoke about in an interview with Paul Rabineau in the 1980s, where he spoke about polemicists, populism, and politics, where he said that to the polemicist, there is only controversy. There's no desire to engage in conversation. There's only an individual who is portrayed as the enemy. And that enemy is the one who needs to be eradicated in order for the narrative which you, as the polemicist, is providing to prevail. That is why you see, for example, certain narratives that Charlie Kirk himself used that you can see similar to Adam Stroots, that you can see similar to Ronaldo Goos, Steve Hofmeyr. The very same buzzwords, the very same discourse is used and reused and recycled by these individuals, almost as if they are so very unoriginal because they follow from the very same script. It's populism, it's polemics, it's a very simple philosophical system which brands them as the insider and the others as the outsider.
I'd love to go on for another hour. I'm afraid we're going to have to start closing down here now. Just one last question. I can recall 1994, well, from the 1990s onwards, 1994. I'm much older than you, so I have very, very vivid memories of it. We were all on like a dopamine high. We were feverish. high on Mandela, I would imagine, high on Desmond Tutu, I would imagine. I said to somebody the other day that there was not a door that would not go open for me during that time. I was literally able to pick up my telephone and ask if I can get a meeting with the French Prime Minister, and the door would swing open because I would use the name Nelson Mandela. South Africa was internationally really the celebration. Last question. Do you believe that we could ever do you believe in the ideals of the multiracial, multicultural democracy, i.e. the rainbow nation? And we have wonderful people in that country, so there's an emotional part to the question. Do you think we could possibly ever rekindle that again?
I don't think we have to rekindle it because, at least in my perspective, with the majority of people, we're already there. We're already there. I've not had a single individual treat me badly because of my white skin. I've never experienced oppression of racial laws. I've never experienced discrimination. I studied on bursaries. My family did not have the opportunity to pay for my studies out of their own wallets, so I had to take out student loans from the bank. And the idea of it being sort of dangerous or even oppressive to white people is foreign to me, because I was on campus during the Fees Must Fall, where I saw students who sat in class next to me, black students who heard smoke bombs go out and didn't know what to do, whose exam sessions were interrupted. So I think, once again, we're already there. I've experienced wonderful conversations, regardless of race, regardless of creed, because of the fact that I put my presuppositions at the door. I experience individuals the way they, project themselves and put themselves to me. And I believe that as you arrive as yourself, others will too. And I think that is both a good and a bad thing. So I think we're already there. I just think that other people are struggling with that. They don't want it because they believe that they are ethnically, socially, religiously, ideologically superior. And unfortunately, there's no curing that. There's no cure for white supremacy. There's just no platforming it. And there's just no engaging with it. There's just no fueling it. And I believe that is essentially where I would end, by also referring to Charles Darwin's Evolution of the Species, or Origins of the Species, where essentially those who did not evolve with the species ended up dying out. And this is what will happen to the Kari Kriels, to the Steve Hofmeyrs, to the Ronaldo Gous, to the Rob Hersofs, to everyone who espouse certain controversial, sort of a countercultural, right-wing, rebellious narrative because they think it's edgy, because they think it's clickbaity. It might be in the next 5 years, but it's not sustainable. And I don't believe that South Africa as a whole, and I'm talking about every race in South Africa, black, white, Indian, colored, all of us are tired of this. And I think the more the youth, especially the young people in my own communities, are tired of seeing these individuals getting away with murder, essentially. And I think that if the previous generation didn't do anything about it, I think that we are about to start doing things about it.
Tristán Kapp, it was my honor. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you for having me on.